الحمد لله رب العالمين ولا عاقبة للمتقين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So بإذن الله تعالى we continue with reading through the explanation of the conditions of the prayer, its pillars and its obligations by the Imam, the Mujaddid, Shaykh al-Islam, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala. And before we move further into the book, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we will quickly recap and summarize that which we have taken from the previous lesson as we began a new topic in relation to the arkan and the pillars of the salah. So we mentioned ijmalan, generally speaking, the arkan of the salah, and we mentioned likewise the definition of al-rukn. The al-rukn in the lugha, in the Arabic language, is janibuhu al-aqwa, yani the strongest part of a thing. And we mentioned in relation to the shara', in relation to the legislation, the difference between the shart and the rukn, the condition and the pillar. And that rukn al-shay juz'un minhu dakhilun fihi, that the pillar of a thing, that it is a part of it and it is inside of it. طيب. In opposition to a shart, in opposition to a condition which is not a part of the actual thing itself, but rather it is mutaqaddim alayhi, rather it precedes it, it comes before it. طيب. And likewise we mentioned the difference between a rukn, between a pillar, and between that which is wajib. طيب. And we mentioned that this difference, that it becomes clear in relation to the qadiyya of nisyan, in relation to forgetfulness. And that is that if a person forgets a pillar, then he is not excused, but rather he needs to repeat and he needs to complete and come with that pillar. As for the obligation, then if he forgets it, that it is sufficient for him to make sujood as-sahw, prostration of forgetfulness, and he is excused and does not need to repeat. طيب. And then we mentioned likewise that the one who leaves off a pillar or an obligation, then his salah is invalid. طيب. But if he leaves it off out of forgetfulness, then as for the pillar, then he needs to repeat and he needs to perform that pillar. But as for the obligation, then it is sufficient for him to make sujood as-sahw. طيب. Then we moved on to the first pillar, and that is al-qiyam al-qudrah, that is standing if one has the ability to do so. And we mentioned pertaining to it that the one who prays sitting, whilst he has the ability to stand, then his salah is not sahihah. His salah is not correct. It is not valid. And this is in relation to the obligatory prayer. And we mentioned in relation to the voluntary prayer that it is permissible for a person to pray while sitting. However, his reward is half of the reward of the one standing. This is in relation to the voluntary prayer. And likewise we mentioned the tremendous hadith of Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wherein he said, إِذَا مَرِضَ الْعَبْدُ أَوْ سَافَرَ كُتِبَ لَهُ مِثْلُ مَا كَانَ يَعْمَلُ مُقِيمًا صَحِيحًا. That if the servant becomes ill or he travels, then it is written for him similar to that which he would do whilst he was in a state of residency and he was in a state of well-being. Then we moved on to the second pillar, And that is Takbiratul Ihram, the opening takbir. And we mentioned the hadith, تحريمها التكبير وتحليلها التسليم. That acts are made unlawful by the takbir and they are made lawful by the taslim. And we mentioned likewise in relation to this tremendous pillar that it is recommended that a person raises his hands. That from the sifatul takbir, takbiratul ihram, is raf'ul yadayn. That a person raises his hands whilst making the takbir. And he raises his hands either to the length of his shoulders or up until his earlobes. And we mentioned likewise that he faces his hands towards the Qibla. And then he makes the takbir and he places his hands upon his chest with his right hand over his left hand. Then we mentioned after it the dua al-istiftah, the opening supplication. And we mentioned that this is from the sunan al-qawliyah. From the sunan al-qawliyah, which are the sunan that pertain to statements. And we began to go through some of the meanings of this dua, this tremendous dua called ad-dua al-istiftah. And we mentioned likewise a qa'idah, a principle in relation to the various wordings of this dua. That we mentioned that there is a principle in fiqh when we find that there are various wordings for one dua or one act. And the principle pertaining to it is that what Shaykh al-Islam rahimahullah ta'ala Ibn Taymiyyah mentions, أن السنن إذا جاءت على أكثر من وجه في مكان واحد فإن الصحيح هو التنوع بينها. That the sunan, that if it has come with multiple variations in a single place, then what is most correct, that a person makes tanawwu', meaning that a person, that he doesn't limit himself to a single one, but rather the sunnah is for him to diversify and to mention a particular wording in one instance, and in another instance then he mentions a different variation or a different wording. And then we mentioned the statement of أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. And likewise we began to explain some of its meaning. And now بإذن الله تعالى that we move on to قراءة الفاتحة. And that is where he said رحمه الله تعالى وقراءة الفاتحة ركن في كل ركعة. And the recitation of Al-Fatiha is a pillar in every single rak'ah. كما في حديث, just as has come in the hadith, لا صلاة لمن لم يقرأ بفاتحة الكتاب وهي القرآن. That there is no prayer for the one who has not recited with فاتحة الكتاب, with surah Al-Fatiha, وهي القرآن, and it is the mother of the Quran. Then Shaykh Abdul Muhsin al-Abbad حفظه ta'ala, he goes on to explain, he says قراءة الفاتحة في كل ركعة من ركعات الصلاة واجبة على الإمام والمأموم والمنفرد. That the recitation of the Fatiha in every single rak'ah from the rak'at of the prayer, it is an obligation upon the Imam, the one being led in the prayer, and the one who is praying by himself. So in every single instance, in every single scenario, whether a person is the imam, or he is being led by an imam, or he is praying individually by himself. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا صلاة لمن لم يقرأ بفاتحة الكتاب. Due to the statement of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم that there is no prayer for the one who has not read and not recited with the Fatihat al-Kitab, surah al-Fatiha. رواه البخاري ومسلم. Then he says, حفظ الله تعالى, والمأموم يقرأها خلف إمامه في الصلاة السرية والجهرية. And the one who is being led in the prayer, then he recites it behind his imam. The one who is being led in the prayer, he recites it behind his imam, behind the one leading him in the prayer. And this is both in the prayer that is sirriyah, is a quiet prayer, and the prayer that is jahriyah, and the loud prayer. ويدل لقراءتها خلفه في الجهرية حديث رجل من أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. And that which is a proof for reciting it behind the imam in the loud prayer is the hadith of the man from the companions of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لعلكم تقرؤون خلف الإمام والإمام يقرأ. That the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم said that perhaps you are reciting behind your imam whilst your imam is reciting. قالوا, so they said, إنا لنفعل ذلك. They said that indeed we do that, meaning we recite behind our imam whilst he is reciting himself. قال, so he said صلى الله عليه وسلم فلا تفعلوا. Do not do so. Do not do so. إلا أن يقرأ أحدكم بأم الكتاب. Except if one of you is reciting with al-Kitab, surah al-Fatiha. أو قال فاتحة الكتاب. رواه أحمد في مسنده بإسناد صحيح. وجاء مثل ذلك من حديث عبادة بن الصامت رضي الله عنه. And similar has come, similar to this hadith has come in the narration of Ubadah ibn Samit رضي الله عنه. وفي إسناده محمد بن إسحاق وقد صرح بالتحديث فأمن تدليسه وراه أحمد في المسند. And in the chain, or found within the chain, is Muhammad ibn Ishaq, and he has clearly expressed tahdith, that he had been narrated, this hadith had been narrated to him, directly to him, so therefore there is no cause for concern regarding his tadlis. And this has been narrated by Ahmad in his Musnad. Then he goes on to say, حفظه الله تعالى, ويجمع بين هذا وبين ما جاء من حديث انتهاء الناس عن القراءة خلف الإمام وحديث من كان له إمام فقراءته قراءة له وحديث وإذا قرأ فأنصتوا يحمل ذلك على قراءة غير الفاتحة. And he said حفظ الله تعالى, and to combine between this and that which has come from the hadith pertaining to the people not reciting behind the imam, the hadith that mentions من كان له إمام فقراءته قراءة له, that whoever has an imam, whoever is being led by an imam, then the recitation of the imam is his recitation. And likewise the hadith وإذا قرأ فأنصتوا, and if he recites, then remain silent. To combine between these hadith, that he says حفظه الله تعالى يحمل ذلك على قراءة غير الفاتحة, that this is intended to mean other than, reciting other than the Fatiha. طيب. And this khilaf is mashhur, is well known, pertaining to this issue of reciting behind the Imam في صلاة الجهرية, reciting behind the Imam in the loud prayers. That the ulama have differed pertaining to this issue, and Shaykh Abdul Muhsin Abad Hafidhahullah Ta'ala, that he has summarized that khilaf briefly for us here. That he's mentioned the various narrations that they bring, and he mentioned to us likewise the khulasa, the outcome of that, and that is that that these narrations, that they are harmonized between them by way of them being pertaining to the recitation that is not Surah Al-Fatiha. So briefly, ya ikhwan, that we will mention some of that which is said pertaining to this issue, and like I mentioned, is a well-known issue that the ulama have discussed, and we will try to understand bi'idhnillahi ta'ala the sabab al-khilaf. What is the reason why they have differed pertaining to this issue? And we find, ya ikhwan, that firstly, or we can say that the first sabab, the first reason as to why they differed, is in relation to the hadith that we mentioned, من كان له إمام فقراءته قراءة له. That whoever has an imam, whoever is being led by an imam, then his recitation is a recitation for him. Meaning that the recitation of the imam is sufficient for him. Meaning that he does not need to recite behind the imam. So some of the ulama that they have included in this surah Al-Fatiha, in the loud prayers, they have included in this that this pertains to the entire Quran, and included in that is surah Al-Fatiha. And likewise, the second sabab, or the second reason as to why they differed, is due to the amr bil insat, the command to remain silent. The command to remain silent whilst the imam is reciting. So again, some of the ulama that they have included this to mean likewise surah Al-Fatiha. That surah Al-Fatiha is included in this. Meaning that if the imam is reciting, then a person is to remain silent. And some of the scholars have included in this surah Al-Fatiha, meaning that he does not recite surah Al-Fatiha behind the imam when the imam is reciting surah Al-Fatiha. And this again is in relation to the salat al-jahriyah, in relation to the loud prayers. And we will come bi'idhnillahi ta'ala shortly to the difference between the loud prayers and the quiet prayers. So some of them have understood this command to remain silent as including likewise surah Al-Fatiha. And they have used the generality of the ahadith pertaining to that. For example, the hadith that he mentioned here, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala, إنما جعل الإمام ليؤتم به فإذا كبر فكبروا وإذا قرأ فأنصتوا. Wherein he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the imam has been placed there in order to be followed. So if he makes takbir, then make takbir. And if he recites, then remain silent. And likewise the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَإِذَا قُرِيَ الْقُرْآنُ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ وَأَنصِتُوا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. And if the Quran is recited, فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ, then pay or listen attentively to it. Pay close attention to it. Listen attentively to it. وَأَنصِتُوا, and remain silent. And this is the shahid here. وَأَنصِتُوا, and remain silent. لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ, perhaps you will be shown mercy. So they use this command, this general command, to remain silent, and they have included within this command surah Al-Fatiha, the entire Quran. And then some of the ulama have made istithna. They have made an exception from this general command. They have made an exception in relation to surah Al-Fatiha. They have combined between these ahadith. They have combined between the hadith pertaining to the qira'ah of the imam being a qira'ah for the one who is being led, and they have said that this hadith is am. There is a general hadith. And likewise the ayah is a general ayah, but it has been made specific by the other ahadith, such as لا صلاة لمن لم يقرأ بفاتحة الكتاب, that there is no prayer for the one who does not read بفاتحة الكتاب, with surah Al-Fatiha. And this is no doubt in relation to the imam and the one who is being led. And there is no exception made here. But rather there is no prayer for the one who does not read surah Al-Fatiha, whether he is an imam or he is being led by an imam. So therefore some of the ulama, that they have excluded surah Al-Fatiha from this general command to remain silent when the Quran is being recited. So in conclusion, then just as Shaykh Abdul Muhsin Abad Hafidahullah Ta'ala, that he mentioned يحمل ذلك على قراءة غير الفاتحة, that this is concerning other than reciting surah Al-Fatiha. So a person, that he should pay attention and he should recite surah Al-Fatiha behind the imam, even in the loud prayers. He recites surah Al-Fatiha behind the imam, even in the salawat that are jahriyah, even in the loud prayers. And he tries to do so in a manner whereby he is not contradicting or conflicting with the imam. That he's not reciting aloud and to the extent that the imam can hear him, where he's confusing the imam. And he tries to do so in a manner whereby he is not reciting at the same time as the imam. So for example, he recites in between the ayat. So the imam says Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, and then he says Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Or he waits for the imam to finish the entire surah, and then he recites and begins his recitation of surah Al-Fatiha quietly to himself. Secondly, ya ikhwan, that we will mention the difference between the qira'ah sirriyah wal jahriyah. What is the dhabit pertaining to reciting aloud and reciting quietly. Then what is the difference between the two? So قراءة الجهرية, the loud recitation, هي أن يقرأ الإنسان بحيث يسمعه من يكون قريبا منه. أن يقرأ الإنسان بحيث يسمعه من يكون قريبا منه. That he recites in a manner by which the one who is near to him can hear him. So this is the loud recitation. He recites in a manner by way the one who is standing near to him can hear him. And this is how some of the ulama have defined it. And as for the قراءة السرية, the silent recitation, هي أن يقرأ الإنسان بحيث يسمع نفسه أو يسمع نفسه ويسمعه من يجاوره. He recites in a manner whereby he can hear his own self. He can hear his own recitation. And the one who is standing directly next to him. And he may be the one standing directly next to him due to his close proximity, that he will be able to hear him. That this is how some of the ulama have defined and distinguished between the two. So the one who is reciting aloud, that the one who is close to him, that he can hear him. So if he's in a room with somebody, that the person in the room will be able to hear him. As for if he's reciting quietly, then it's done in a manner that he can hear his own self, or the one who is standing directly next to him is perhaps able to pick up on what he is saying. This is how some of the ulama have defined it. And some of them have said that rather he does not recite aloud to his own self, but rather it's sufficient for him حركة اللسان والفم بها. It's sufficient for him to simply move his tongue and his mouth. That he moves his tongue and his mouth, even if he is not able to hear his own recitation. But what is important is that his tongue and his mouth are moving. In opposition to what some of the people think. That some of the people think that the silent recitation is done by standing completely silent, without moving their lips, without moving their tongue. And this in reality is not considered as qira'ah. It's not considered as a recitation. بل ولا كلام. But rather it's not even considered as speech. It's not even considered as speech. And it's an important point to note, because there are many other people who think that them not moving their tongue, or they think that the silent recitation is done inwardly, whereby they do not even move their tongue or their lips. And no doubt that this is khata, this is an error, this is a mistake. And this jeopardizes one's salah, one's prayer. Why? Because he has no recitation. And the one who has no recitation, then he has not recited Fatiha. And if he has not recited Fatiha, then he has no salah. Then he has no prayer. طيب. Then Shaykh Abdul Muhsin Abad Hafidahullah Ta'ala, he goes on to say, ثم إن الشيخ رحمه الله فسر الفاتحة تفسيرا موجزا. Then the Shaykh Rahimahullah Ta'ala, that he began to explain Surah Al-Fatiha with a brief explanation. فقال, so he said, بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بركة واستعانة. That he said, بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم is يعني بركة is done seeking blessings, واستعانة, and seeking aid and assistance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. والمعنى أن المسلم يأتي بالبسملة تبركا بسم الله ومستعينا بالله في قراءته. Meaning that the Muslim, that he says the Basmallah, seeking blessings with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and seeking assistance from Allah Azza wa Jal in his recitation. وكذلك الحال في أي شيء يأتي بالتسمية قبله. And this is the case in all affairs with regards to anything, that he comes with the saying of Bismillah before it. يأتي بها تبركا واستعانة, that he says it seeking blessings and seeking aid and assistance. ويقرأ البسملة سرا, and he recites the Basmallah quietly. He recites the Basmallah quietly. والبسملة آية من القرآن. And the Basmallah is an ayah from the Quran. وهل هي آية من كل سورة? But is it an ayah from every single chapter? أو آية مستقلة للفصل بين الصور? Or is it an ayah, a separate ayah, used to distinguish between the various chapters? And this is where some of the ulama have differed. وهل هي آية من سورة الفاتحة أو ليست منها? And is it an ayah from Surah Al-Fatiha, or is it not a part of it? And this is extremely important to understand, ya ikhwan. Extremely important point. And why is it important? Because if the Basmallah is considered as an ayah from Al-Fatiha, and a person doesn't recite it, then he has not recited Surah Al-Fatiha. Again, if it's considered as an ayah from Surah Al-Fatiha and a person does not recite it, then he has not recited Al-Fatiha. And if he hasn't recited Al-Fatiha, لا صلاة له, then he has no prayer. If he hasn't recited Al-Fatiha, لا صلاة له, then he has no prayer. So it's an important point to understand. Then it says, حفظ الله أقوال لأهل العلم, that there are various statements and opinions of for the people of knowledge. ويدل على أنها من القرآن, and that which highlights and shows that is from the Quran, أن الصحابة أدخلوها في المصحف ولم يدخلوا فيه إلا ما هو قرآن. And that which shows that the Basmallah is an ayah from the Quran is that the companions, that they included it in the Mus'haf. The companions, when they compiled the Mus'haf, that they included it within it. And they would not include within it except that which is Quran. وجاء في سنن أبي داود بسند صحيح عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما قال كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يعرف فصل السورة حتى تنزل عليه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. And there's common narration from Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he would not know the separation between the chapters up until there would be revealed to him Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. ولا خلاف بين أهل العلم في أن البسملة بعض آية في أثناء سورة النمل. And there is no difference of opinion amongst the people of knowledge that the Basmallah is part of the ayah in Surah Al-Naml. That is found in Surah Al-Naml. And that is the ayah where Allah Azza wa Jal said, إِنَّهُ مِن سُلَيْمَانَ وَإِنَّهُ بِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ. There is no khilaf between Ahl al-Ilm that this is an ayah from Surah Al-Naml. وسورة الفاتحة 7 آيات. And Surah Al-Fatiha is 7 verses, 7 ayat. This is something again that is agreed upon. There is no difference of opinion amongst Ahl al-Ilm. فمن قال من العلماء إنها آية من الفاتحة عد البسملة في السبع. So those who say from amongst Ahl al-Ilm, from amongst the ulama, that the Basmallah is a ayah from Fatiha, then they have included it in the 7 ayat. ومن قال إنها ليست من الفاتحة جعل السابعة غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. And those who have said that it is not from Surah Al-Fatiha, meaning that it is not from the 7 ayat, that they have made the 7th ayah غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. That they have made this part as the 7th ayah. طيب, then he says حفظ الله تعالى ومما استدل به على أن البسملة ليست آية من الفاتحة قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم في الحديث القدسي. And that which shows and is an evidence that the Basmallah is not an ayah from Surah Al-Fatiha is his statement صلى الله عليه وسلم in the hadith al-Qudsi. قال الله عز وجل قسمت الصلاة بيني وبين عبدي نصفين ولعبدي ما سأل فإذا قال العبد الحمد لله رب العالمين قال الله تعالى حمدني عبدي. الحديث رواه مسلم عن أبي هريرة فلم يذكر البسملة فيها. The hadith al-Qudsi, wherein Allah Azza wa Jal said that I have divided up the prayer between me and my servant into 2 halves. And for my servant is that which he asks. And if my servant says, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, then Allah Azza wa Jal says that my servant has praised me. Al-Hadith, the hadith, which is narrated or collected by Imam Muslim on the authority of Abu Hurairah radiallahu an. For shahid, and the point being here that he subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah Azza wa Jal, that he didn't mention the Basmallah. He didn't begin with the Basmallah. And likewise, ya ikhwan, from the adillah, from the evidences, is that he sallallahu alayhi wa sallam كان لا يجهر بها في الغالب. That the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that he would not recite it out loud في الغالب, in the majority of the time, that he would not recite the Basmallah out loud. So they say that if it was a part of the surah, then he sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would have recited it aloud, just as he would for the rest of the surah. And some of the ulama, that they said that the Basmallah is an ayah from Al-Fatiha. And they have responded to this, this last evidence that we mentioned, and they said that he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not reciting it out loud does not prove and does not show that it is not an ayah from Al-Fatiha, that it is not an ayah from surah Al-Fatiha. And they use as a proof, likewise, ya ikhwan, they use as a proof to say that the Basmallah is an ayah from surah Al-Fatiha, they use as a proof the hadith of Abi Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, that is collected by Darqutni wal Bayhaqi. And that is that he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إذا قرأتم الحمد لله فاقرأوا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فإنها من القرآن وأم الكتاب والسبع المثاني وبسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إحدى آياتها. That he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that if you recite Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, meaning if you recite Surah Al-Fatiha, then recite Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. For indeed it is from the Quran, and it is the mother of the book, and it is the Sab' al-Muthani, and Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is one of its verses. The Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is one of its verses. And this hadith, ya ikhwan, that the scholars have differed whether it is marfu' or mawquf. Whether it is marfu', meaning whether it is attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whether it goes back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or it is a hadith which is mawquf. And if it is marfu', then no doubt, ya ikhwan, then it is a daleel that is qawi, is a strong evidence for those who hold it to be marfu'. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah Ta'ala knows best. وعلى كل فلا ينبغي أن تترك. لا ينبغي أن تترك. It is not befitting that a person leaves it. It's not befitting that a person leaves it. Meaning it's not befitting that a person doesn't recite it. And this, ya ikhwan, likewise is a good example of that reoccurring principle that we have been mentioning, and that is khuruj min al-khilaf. In order to exit from the khilaf, from the differing, and in order to exit from these various opinions of Ahl al-Ilm, that it is better that one recites it. And that one does not leave it off, but rather he recites it, no doubt, and it is wajibah, it is an obligation for him to recite it. It is not befitting that he leave it off, and Allah Ta'ala knows best. طيب بإذن الله تعالى يا إخوان نكتفي بهذا. We will suffice with what we have mentioned, and بإذن الله تعالى next week that we will continue to go through the rest of the tafsir the explanation of this tremendous surah, Surah Al-Fatiha, بإذن الله تعالى. ونكتفي بهذا، وصل اللهم وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين، والحمد لله رب العالمين، وبارك الله فيكم.